The deed was already signed before Violet Abbott understood what she was looking at. She stood in the middle of the Redemption Springs Sheriff's office, the single sheet of parchment trembling in both her hands, the ink still carrying the faint ghost of a quill's last drag across the page. Every piece of property her father had lost to the Prescott gang over the course of 3 brutal years: the Abbott Ranch, the grazing land along Copper Creek, the water rights to the Eastern Well, even the small parcel of orchard her mother had planted before the fever took her. It was all listed there, line by line, transferred back into the name of Violet Margaret Abbott, signed and witnessed, and sealed with the territorial stamp of 1883. And standing 10 feet away from her, hat in hand, dust on his coat, a jaw that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, was Noah Prescott himself. He did not look like a man who expected forgiveness. He did not look like a man who was asking for it either. "You can have me arrested now," he said, his voice low and careful, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed something difficult and are afraid the words will come out wrong anyway. "I told the sheriff everything. The Copper Creek robbery, the land deed fraud, all of it. There is a written confession on his desk." Violet's throat tightened so fiercely she thought for a moment she might not be able to speak at all. She had spent 3 years imagining this man. 3 years building him in her mind into something enormous and monstrous, a shadow that stretched across every room she walked into, a name that made her jaw clench involuntarily whenever anyone said it aloud. Noah Prescott, the man who had taken her father's land through forged documents and intimidation, and one night of violence she did not let herself remember too clearly. And here he was, not enormous, not monstrous. Just a man with a broken straight jaw and quiet eyes who had ridden back into Redemption Springs alone, without his gang, without a weapon on his hip, to hand everything back. Everything except the things she had not known he had taken. Because Noah Prescott carried the memory of her voice. He had carried it for 3 years, across 4 territories, through 6 different crimes and a dozen narrow escapes and 1 brutal winter spent in a mining camp outside of Tucson. He had carried the memory of a single evening, 4 years ago, before any of it had started, when he had passed the Abbott Ranch at dusk and heard a woman singing to herself somewhere in the kitchen garden. Not performing, not aware of any audience. Just a quiet, unhurried voice moving through the words of an old hymn, the way water moves through familiar stone. It had stopped him dead in the road. He had stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, unable to make himself move, feeling something in his chest shift so profoundly he had not been able to name it until much later, when it was far too late. He had never told anyone. He was not sure he intended to tell her now. But she was standing in front of him with the deed in her shaking hands and her dark eyes full of something that was not yet anger and not yet anything else. And Noah Prescott, who had confessed everything to a lawman without flinching, found he could not look directly at her for more than a few seconds at a time. Sheriff Dale Morrow cleared his throat from his chair beside the desk, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the careful neutrality of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by what people will do to one another. "Miss Abbott," he said, "the confession is valid. The property transfer is legal. What happens next is partly your decision." Violet set the deed down very carefully on the edge of the desk, as though it might shatter. Then she looked at Noah Prescott with the full weight of everything those 3 years had cost her, and she said with perfect steadiness, "Why?" It was not a question, it was a demand. And it was addressed not to his actions, which she understood well enough: money, desperation, bad men around worse opportunities, but to something underneath the actions, something she had not yet found a shape for, and neither, it seemed, had he. Noah held her gaze for exactly the amount of time it takes a man to decide whether he is going to tell the truth. "Because I owe it," he said, "and because some debts don't stop collecting interest just because you stop paying attention to them." It was not the whole truth, but it was the beginning of it. And it was there, in that dusty sheriff's office in the autumn of 1883, with a signed confession on the desk, and a land deed in her hands and 3 years of accumulated damage between them, that the story of Noah Prescott and Violet Abbott ceased to be a story about crime and loss, and became, quietly and against every reasonable expectation of both parties, a love story. Violet Abbott had come to Redemption Springs, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, when she was 22 years old, riding in the back of a wagon with her father, George Abbott, and a modest collection of household goods and seed stock, and a pair of draft horses named Clement and Josephine. Her mother, Clara, had died the previous winter of typhoid fever. The grief was still fresh and sharp-edged, but Violet had her father's practical temperament and her mother's quiet resilience, and she set about building the new ranch with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. George Abbott was a good man with a weakness for optimism that sometimes tipped into recklessness. He had borrowed money to expand the herd in the summer of 1879, confident that the eastern markets would pay well, and for a while they had. The Abbott Ranch grew to encompass 300 acres of decent grazing land along the eastern edge of Copper Creek, and Violet learned the work of it thoroughly: the cattle, the planting, the bookkeeping, the negotiations with the feed merchant in town, all of it. She made friends slowly, the way people do in places where trust is earned rather than assumed. Margaret Hale, the schoolteacher, became the closest thing to a confidant she had. The two women shared Sunday afternoon walks and honest conversation, which was rarer in Redemption Springs than water and more valuable than either of them said aloud. The trouble began in the fall of 1880, when a man named Harlan Cole arrived in the territory with money and intentions that he kept carefully separate in conversation. Harlan Cole was not a dramatic villain. He was worse than that. He was a patient one. He bought legitimate land, cultivated legitimate relationships, cultivated a legitimate reputation, and used all three as cover for the slower, quieter work of acquisition. He identified ranchers who were slightly over-leveraged, and he sent men to encourage circumstances that would push them further into debt. And then he arrived with documents that were very nearly legal and offers that were very nearly fair, and left with more than he came with. Noah Prescott had been one of Harlan Cole's men. This was the fact that Violet held in her chest like a splinter. Not that Noah had been an outlaw, because outlaws were comprehensible enough, but that he had been a specific kind of outlaw, the kind employed in the service of a specific kind of cruelty. He had ridden to the Abbott Ranch on a February night in 1881 with two other men, and they had broken the fence line on the eastern pasture and driven off 14 head of cattle, and that loss, compounded with the existing debt, had been enough for Harlan Cole to arrive the following month with his documents and his reasonable voice and his offer. George Abbott had fought it. He had ridden to the territorial court in Santa Fe and filed challenges, and spent money he did not have on a lawyer who was better at taking fees than winning cases. And in the end, Cole had the land and Abbott had the legal bills. He and Violet had relocated to a small house at the edge of town, and George had taken work as a hand on the Creighton spread, and the humiliation of it had aged him visibly over the 2 years that followed. Violet had managed the small house and taken in laundry and done careful bookkeeping for the feed merchant 3 days a week, and she had never once permitted herself to weep where anyone could see. But at night, alone, she had built a comprehensive and precise anger. She had memorized every name connected to what had happened: Harlan Cole, 2 men named Tuck Sampson and Reller Briggs, and Noah Prescott. She had not anticipated that Noah Prescott would walk back into her life, wearing the expression of a man who had made peace with being despised. In the days following that first meeting in the sheriff's office, Violet found herself encountering a problem she had not prepared for. Noah Prescott did not leave. She had expected him to hand over the deed and disappear, the way guilty men do when they have completed their penance and wish to be done with the discomfort of proximity to their conscience. Instead, he took a room at the Redemption Springs boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Fenn, paid 2 weeks in advance, and began the quiet process of doing whatever needed doing without being asked. He repaired the fence along the eastern pasture, which had been broken in one form or another since that February night 3 years before, and had never been properly mended by the ranch's interim occupants. He did it without announcement, rising early and working until midday. Using lumber and wire, he purchased himself from the hardware merchant on Main Street. When Violet came out to examine the work, because she intended to inspect it critically and find fault if fault was findable, she discovered that it was expertly done, the posts set plumb and the wire stretched tight, and the corners braced correctly, the way a man does it who has worked ranching long enough to understand what a fence is actually for. She stood looking at it for a long time. Noah was at the far end of the line, driving the last staple into the last post. He did not come toward her. He did not explain himself. He simply finished what he was doing, picked up his tools, and walked back toward town with his hat low against the afternoon sun. The anger she had been carrying did not disappear. It was too old and too carefully maintained for that. But it acquired a small, uncomfortable companion, something that felt unsettlingly like curiosity. She asked Margaret Hale about him that Sunday, framing it as an information-gathering exercise rather than anything personal, which Margaret was gracious enough to pretend to believe. "He used to work for Cole," Violet said, as they walked the road south of town. "How did he end up here alone, without Cole and without the others?" Margaret, who made it her business to know the useful history of every person in the territory, considered the question carefully. "From what I understand, there was a falling out about 2 years ago. Harlan Cole's operation moved further south, toward the Arizona line. From what people say, Noah Prescott refused something Cole asked him to do, something that crossed a line he had apparently identified." Violet thought about this. "What kind of line?" "The kind involving a family," Margaret said. "A woman and her children. I don't know the details. I know that Prescott rode out, and Cole sent Tuck Sampson after him, and Prescott apparently convinced Sampson not to pursue the matter, and after that Cole left him alone. Which suggests," she added carefully, "that whatever he knew about Cole's operation was sufficient leverage. He could have used that to destroy Cole entirely," Violet said. "Yes, he could have. He didn't. No, not until now." Margaret looked sideways at her. The confession he gave Sheriff Morrow was apparently quite detailed. Violet absorbed this. "What happens to Cole?" "Morrow sent the documentation to the marshal's office in Santa Fe 2 weeks ago. I imagine Cole is currently paying very careful attention to what roads the federal men are using." There was a long silence filled with the sound of wind through dry grass. "He rode back here alone," Violet said. It was not addressed to Margaret. It was addressed to the air, to the quality of the fact itself, which she was still turning over trying to find an angle at which it made sense without reference to herself. Margaret did not respond. She was kind enough not to. Noah Prescott had not planned to return to Redemption Springs. He had spent the better part of 6 months in the prior year sitting in a rented room in Socorro, working as a horse trader and doing the slow, grinding accounting of a life that had been spent in the service of other people's cruelty. He had made a list, not a metaphorical list, but an actual one, written in pencil in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Names, properties, specific amounts of damage. He had gone through it methodically, territory by territory, and spent the money he had saved, because Noah Prescott had almost no expenses and had always been disciplined about money, which was one of those qualities that become sinister in the wrong context, tracking down the people Cole had hurt and finding ways to repair what could be repaired. Some of it was simple. Cash returned through anonymous envelopes. Livestock located at various spreads in Arizona and New Mexico, and returned to their original owners with plain notes explaining nothing. Legal documentation filed with territorial courts. The Abbott ranch had been last because it was the hardest and because it was the one he thought about the most, and because he was honest enough with himself to understand that those two facts were connected. He had not planned what he was going to say to her. He had discovered, upon the actual event of standing in front of her, that there was nothing adequate to say. The deed was the statement. The confession was the statement. He had made himself available to be arrested and tried and sentenced, and he had tried to feel resolved about this, and mostly he had succeeded. The problem was that she had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said, "Why?" in that voice, and something he had been holding carefully closed for 3 years had opened a fraction, and now he could not quite close it again. He found reasons to be useful. He was not a man who was comfortable with inactivity, and he was not a man who knew how to make conversation about nothing. He worked. He had always worked. He repaired the fence, and then he found that the pump behind the Abbott house had a cracked seal and replaced it. And then he saw that 2 of the window frames on the south side of the house were beginning to rot, and he purchased the lumber to fix them. Violet Abbott watched him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had always been good at reading people. It was what had made him valuable to Cole. He could predict what a man would do under pressure. He could identify the particular quality of bluff in a voice, the precise moment when resistance would crumble. He had not enjoyed the use of this skill, but he had possessed it. With Violet, he got approximately half of what she was thinking, and the other half she kept in a place he could not see into. He was not accustomed to this. He found it profoundly disorienting and, in a way that made no logical sense given the circumstances, compelling. The first time they actually spoke at length was in the 2nd week of his return, when she came out of the house in the early morning and found him repairing the pump and said, without preamble, "You don't have to do this." He looked up at her. She was in a plain work dress, her dark hair braided back, and she was carrying a coffee pot and 2 tin cups, which she set on the porch railing with the air of someone who had made a practical decision. "I know," he said. "You've already returned the land. You've given the confession. There's nothing further required of you. I know that too." She looked at the pump. "The seal on that was cracked before any of this started. That's not something that can be attributed to the gang." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee and left one on the railing and took the other back to the porch steps, where she sat down. It was a very deliberate gesture of neither hostility nor invitation, but rather of acknowledgement, which was a more sophisticated social communication than most people in the territory were capable of, and Noah noticed it clearly. He finished replacing the seal, wiped his hands on a cloth, and retrieved the coffee from the railing. He did not approach her further. He stood at the edge of the yard and drank it, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile, and it had the quality of something that was being carefully constructed. "Where did you learn to work fence like that?" she said, eventually. It was not quite a question, more of an opening. "Texas," he said. "I worked cattle in the Panhandle before I came west. Legitimate work, 6 years of it." He paused. "In case that matters to you." "It matters," she said. "Not in the way you might think. I'm not making a ledger." "Then why does it matter?" She turned her cup in her hands and thought about this. "Because it means you knew what you were helping Cole take. You understood exactly what this kind of land meant to people like my father. The truth of this landed cleanly and without embellishment, the way she seemed to say most things, and Noah accepted it. "Yes," he said, "I understood exactly. And you did it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "For how long did you tell yourself it was just work?" He thought about this seriously because she deserved a serious answer. "About 8 months. After that I stopped telling myself anything and just kept doing it, which is a different and worse kind of cowardice." Violet Abbott was quiet for a long time. The morning was still and cool, and a pair of sparrows were arguing in the juniper beside the porch, and the territory stretched out behind the house in that particular slanting autumn light that makes the high desert look like a painting of itself. "What made you stop?" she said. He told her about the family. He had not intended to tell her, but he found that the words came out with the same feeling as the confession to the sheriff, not relief exactly, but the absence of a specific weight. The family had been a widow named Mrs. Cordero and her 2 sons, near Roswell. Cole had wanted the land for the water rights, and Cole had told Noah to persuade her. He had told him what persuade meant in this context, which was the same thing it had always meant, which was threaten. Noah had ridden to the Cordero place and knocked on the door and seen who opened it, and understood with sudden, complete clarity that he was not going to do what he had come to do, and that this clarity had been available to him for some time, if he had chosen to look in the right direction. Violet listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Cordero still has her land. Yes, you know this. I made sure." She looked at him for a long time with that expression he couldn't entirely read, and then she stood up, collected the coffee cups, and went back inside. But she left the door open. It was an ambiguous act. He chose to take it as a beginning. George Abbott had returned to the ranch 2 weeks after the deed transfer, moving slowly because his health had deteriorated, and he looked at the land he had lost with an expression that broke Violet's heart quietly and completely. He was 61 years old, and the past 3 years had cost him something physical, some structural thing in his posture and his pace that had not been there before. He shook Noah Prescott's hand with the formal courtesy of a man who has decided to behave with dignity even in profoundly undignified circumstances. It was one of the finest things Violet had ever watched her father do, and she loved him fiercely for it. "You returned what you took," George said. "That's more than most men would do." "It's less than you deserved," Noah said, which was the right answer and the only one that could have been right. George nodded. He kept Noah's hand in his for a moment with the slightly longer grip of a man making an assessment, and then released it. "Violet tells me you've been fixing the place up. Some things needed doing. I imagine they did." George looked across the land with careful eyes. "I imagine there's more that will need doing before winter." "I imagine so." George Abbott looked at his daughter. Violet looked back at her father. Neither of them said anything further on the subject, but something had passed between them that functioned as permission, even though nobody had formally asked for it. October came to the New Mexico territory with cold nights and brilliant days, and the ranch came back to life around its original occupants, with the slow, accumulating energy of restoration. George repaired himself alongside his land, visibly and measurably, gaining color and motion, and the particular engaged quality of a man who has recovered his purpose. Noah Prescott was there most days, working with the efficiency of someone who does not need to be directed. He and George established a practical working relationship that did not require extensive conversation, which suited both of them. Violet watched this and felt things she was not yet ready to examine directly. She was 27 years old and she had not been frivolous about men, which was partly circumstance and partly temperament. She had been courted twice in Redemption Springs and found both experiences unsatisfying, not because the men were bad but because they were performing courtship at her rather than speaking to her, and there was a crucial difference. She did not want to be addressed like a category. She wanted to be addressed like herself. Noah Prescott talked to her like a specific person. This was destabilizing in ways she had not anticipated. He asked her what she thought about things. Not small, safe things, but actual things. The way the territorial government was managing the water rights dispute along the Pecos, the fairness of the contract terms the feed merchant offered to small ranchers, what she thought about the Apache conflicts, which were entering a particularly difficult period that autumn. He asked, and then he listened to the answers with the quality of attention that indicates genuine interest rather than the performance of it. And he gave his own opinions plainly and without flourish. And when she disagreed with him, he accepted her counterargument and thought about it rather than simply restating his position more emphatically. This was, Violet privately reflected, a remarkably attractive quality in a person. She was still angry. She wanted to be clear about this with herself. The anger was real and it was earned and it lived in a specific place, and it did not simply dissolve because Noah Prescott was good with fence lines and listened well and had honest eyes. But it was beginning to exist alongside other things, in the way that emotions do when a situation refuses to be simple. The evening in late October that changed everything began as an ordinary one. Noah had stayed past sunset helping George with the task of winterizing the back pasture fence, which involved more work than anticipated, and Violet had made supper for three without making a production of the decision, and the three of them ate together in the kitchen, with the lamp burning warm and the wind beginning outside, and the ordinary sounds of an occupied house around them. After George retired, which he did early these days because the physical work was genuinely tiring him, Violet and Noah found themselves at the kitchen table with the remains of supper and the lamp between them. She was going through the ranch's account books, which she had taken back from the feed merchant the previous week, and was in the process of fully reconciling. He was mending a piece of harness leather that had been waiting for attention for weeks. They worked in silence for a long time, and it was not a silence that needed filling. At some point, Violet looked up from the accounts and found him looking at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before, or perhaps had seen, and not allowed herself to acknowledge. It was careful and unguarded at the same time, which should have been a contradiction but wasn't, because the carefulness was not about concealing what he felt but about choosing how to hold it in a situation where he had forfeited the right to declare it. "Noah," she said. He looked down at the harness. "You should tell me if I'm making things difficult," he said. "You're not." "I could." She set down her pencil. "Tell me something honest," she said. He thought about this for a moment. "I came back here because the debt was real and the property was yours and it was the right thing to do. That's true." He looked up at her. "It's not the whole truth. Tell me the rest." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he told her about the evening 4 years ago when he had passed the ranch at dusk on the road south of town and heard her singing in the garden. He told it plainly without embellishment, and he did not make it into something romantic in the telling, because he was a man who distrusted ornamentation. He told it like what it was, an honest account of an experience that had lodged in him and refused to leave. Violet was very still. "I know that changes nothing about what I did," he said. "I'm not offering it as an excuse or as a trade. I'm offering it because you asked for the whole truth and that's what's there." She looked at her hands on the account book. Outside, the wind had gotten into the juniper tree and was making it talk to itself. "I remember that evening," she said quietly. "I was singing for my mother. It was the anniversary of her death." She looked up at him. "You heard that?" "Yes." "And kept it?" "Yes." She exhaled very slowly. "That is an enormous amount to carry without permission," she said, and her voice was not angry exactly, but it was thoughtful in a way that had its edges. "I know it is. And you did everything you did in the years after carrying that." "Yes." "That must have been very uncomfortable," she said, "and it could have been cutting, but it wasn't quite, because underneath the careful steadiness of it was something warmer." "It was," he said. "It was the most uncomfortable thing I've ever done." Violet looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I'm not ready to give you anything, Noah. I want you to understand that. There's too much between here and wherever that conversation might lead. I understand. But I don't want you to leave." He held this carefully. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She picked up her pencil and returned to the accounts. He returned to the harness. And the lamp burned between them, and the wind went on in the juniper, and nothing was resolved and everything was different. The news about Harlan Cole came in November. A federal marshal named Anson Webb arrived in Redemption Springs on a gray morning with 2 deputies and the professional confidence of a man who has warrants in his pocket, and he sat with Sheriff Morrow for an hour, and then sent word that he needed to speak with Noah Prescott. Violet was with Noah when the message arrived, which was how it happened that she walked with him to the sheriff's office and stood outside it while the conversation took place, and she was still standing there, very straight, when he came out 40 minutes later. "They found Cole in Arizona Territory," he said. "Near Bisbee. He's in federal custody. He paused. "Marshal Webb needs me to go to Tucson to testify. The other men they've arrested, Sampson, Briggs, others, they'll all testify, but Webb says my account is the most detailed and the most legally actionable." "When?" Violet said. "2 weeks, 3 at most." He looked at her steadily. "I'll come back." "That's not what I was going to ask." "What were you going to ask?" She looked at him carefully. "Whether you're afraid." Something in his face shifted. "Of Cole, no. Of what the testimony means." "You mean being on record as the man who brought him down, who named every name and detailed every operation?" "Yes." He thought about this. "A little," he said honestly. "Cole has people, but he's going to prison, and I know how to be careful." "I know you do," she said, and then seemed surprised by the steadiness of her own confidence in him. They looked at each other. "I'll be back," he said again. "I heard you the first time," she said. And the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not yet a smile, but was the honest precursor of one. And Noah Prescott carried that expression to Tucson with him, the way he had carried her voice for 4 years, as something precious that belonged only to him. The 3 weeks he was gone were among the longer 3 weeks of Violet Abbott's life. She was not a woman given to romantic fantasy, but she was an honest person, and honesty requires accounting for what is actually present in one's interior landscape. And what was present in hers during those 3 weeks was something she had been trying to file under cautious neutrality, and was failing to properly categorize. She worked the ranch with her father and told herself she was being sensible. She was being sensible. Caution was appropriate. He had been one of the men responsible for the worst 3 years of her family's life. These were facts, and they did not stop being facts because he had returned what he took and fixed the pump and listened to her with genuine attention. And yet, she found herself in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the empty chair across from her. And she found that the empty chair was information. She wrote to him once, which felt significant but was practically justified by the fact that there was a question about the water rights documentation that required his signature on one additional form. She made the letter practical and brief, and then read it over and added one additional sentence at the end that said she hoped the testimony was going well, and then folded it before she could change her mind. He wrote back within a week, which surprised her in its speed, and the letter was practical at the front and less practical at the back, and it ended with the line, "I think about you more than is probably useful." And she read this 4 times and then put it in the drawer with the account books, which was where she kept the things she was protecting. He came back on a Tuesday, early in December, riding through a light snow on a horse he had bought in Tucson because his previous one had gone lame on the way south. He came to the ranch first, before the boarding house, before anything. He dismounted at the gate, and Violet was on the porch because she had seen him coming up the road, and she had told herself she was simply checking on the weather. He opened the gate and walked up the path, and she stood on the porch steps, and when he stopped at the foot of them, they were at eye level with each other. "Cole," she said. "Convicted," he said. "He'll be in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth by spring. The rest of the operation is dismantled." She absorbed this. "And you?" "I'm here," he said. "Nothing's following me. I'm just here." She looked at him in the cold December air, the snow coming down slowly around them both, and something she had been carefully balancing resolved itself into a single clear note the way a tuning fork rings when it's finally struck. "Come inside," she said. "My father is going to want to hear about the trial." "Is that why you're inviting me in?" "No," she said simply and honestly. And Noah Prescott came inside. What followed was not a swift transformation. Neither of them was built for swift transformations, and the situation did not call for one. What it called for was the careful, honest dismantling of distance between 2 people who have substantial reasons for being cautious, and are choosing, deliberately, to be brave anyway. George Abbott watched it happen with the quiet approval of a father who loves his daughter, and is old enough to know that love comes in inconvenient forms, and that the appropriate response to this is not objection but gratitude. He said nothing about it directly. He simply made sure he was tired early on the evenings when it seemed like a conversation needed to happen without him present. And he maintained the working alliance with Noah that had developed since October. And occasionally he said things like, "The girl needs somebody who isn't afraid of her mind," and left the sentences to live in the air. The first time Noah took her hand was on a December afternoon when they were walking the boundary of the north pasture to assess what needed doing in the spring. It was not dramatic. They had been walking in companionable silence, and he simply put his hand out as they crossed a rocky section of ground, ostensibly to help her over the uneven terrain, and she took it, and when they reached level ground again, neither of them released it for some time. They kept walking, and Violet felt her heart doing something elaborate and tried to be rational about it, and failed, and decided to be fine about the failure. "I don't know how to do this," he said, eventually. "I've been trying to figure out how to say things to you for a long time, and I keep coming up against the fact that I don't have a template for a situation that starts where this one starts." "Where do you think it starts?" she said. "With me owing you something enormous. You paid that, with the property, yes. What else is there?" He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The north pasture spread out around them in the winter quiet, the dry grass silver with frost, the mountains blue in the distance. "I want to be with you," he said, "not to settle a debt, not because of what I felt 4 years ago, although I still feel it. Because of who you are right now, today, this version of you that I've spent the past 2 months coming to understand as well as I understand anything." He looked at her steadily. "I know I'm not a clean proposition." "I never wanted a clean proposition," she said. "Clean propositions are for people who want to be comfortable. I want to be honest." She looked at him. "And honestly, Noah, I've been in love with you since approximately mid-October, and I've been being extremely rational about it ever since, and I'm tired." He stared at her. "You can say something now," she said. He exhaled, and the cold air made it visible. And he was laughing, not performing laughter, but genuinely laughing, in a way she had not yet seen him do. And it altered his face entirely and made him look younger and less careful, and like someone who had just been handed something he had stopped expecting. He kissed her, there in the north pasture with the frost on the grass, and it was not tentative. It had waited long enough to already know what it was. Christmas of 1883 was the finest the Abbott ranch had celebrated in years. Violet made a proper meal and invited Margaret Hale and her elderly mother, and Mrs. Fenn from the boarding house, and Sheriff Morrow and his wife, and the table was full and loud and warm. Noah sat beside Violet, and her father sat at the head of the table and looked around it with an expression that was nothing short of joy. It was the kind of evening that is simple on the surface and carries tremendous weight underneath, because the simplicity has been paid for. After the guests had gone, George retired and Violet and Noah stood on the porch in the cold, their breath clouding in the dark, the stars so dense overhead they appeared to be arranged by someone extravagant. "I keep waiting for it to feel complicated," Violet said. "It is complicated," he said. "It just doesn't feel like a problem anymore." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the cold and the starlight, and Violet thought about the person she had been 2 months ago, standing in the sheriff's office with the deed in her shaking hands and 3 years of careful, precise anger in her chest. And she thought about the extraordinary and unlikely navigations that had brought her to this porch, this night, this arm around her. And she found that the anger had not disappeared so much as been metabolized into something else. Something that was neither forgiveness nor forgetting, because forgetting was not honest, and she was always honest, but was more like the way a scar becomes simply a part of your skin, present, known, no longer an injury. Noah said, "Next spring when the weather opens up, I'd like to rebuild the barn. The east wall is not going to last another year." "I know," she said, "and there are about 40 acres in the south section that could be seeded properly if someone did the drainage work first. I know that too. I'm telling you because I'm planning to be here to do it." She turned her face up toward his. "Are you being practical or romantic right now?" "In my experience," he said, "the best version of either one is both at the same time." She laughed, and it was her real laugh, unguarded and warm, and Noah Prescott heard it and added it to the collection of things he carried, this time with full permission. January and February were hard months on the high desert, as they always were, with cold that came in sideways and ice that made the roads dangerous, and the particular long indoor quality of winter that tests the tempers of people who prefer to be active. Noah moved from the boarding house into the small bunkroom attached to the barn, a move that was practical, as George needed daily help, and the road from town was often impassable, and a move that George Abbott acknowledged with a handshake and nothing further said. The three of them developed the rhythms of a household. George cooked breakfast, which he was good at and enjoyed. Violet managed the accounts and the correspondence and the 100 small decisions that ranch life required. Noah worked the exterior, the animals, the structures, the machinery, and the infrastructure that kept everything functioning. In the evenings, they ate together and talked about what needed doing and sometimes about other things. And occasionally Violet would play her father's small parlor organ, which had come west with them from Missouri and had survived everything. And Noah would sit in the corner chair with some piece of work in his hands and listen. He never said anything about it because there was nothing adequate to say. He simply listened, and she was aware of him listening, and she played for both of them. In March, he asked George Abbott for permission to court her formally. He did this with the directness that characterized everything he did, sitting across from George at the kitchen table after supper with the plain statement that he wanted to marry Violet if she'd have him, and that he understood if George had objections, and that he was asking because it was the right way to do things. George looked at him for a long time. "You know my girl well enough to know she'll make her own decision," he said. "I do know that. I'm asking you because you deserve to be asked, not because I think I need your permission to speak to her." George nodded slowly. "Smart answer," he said, "and the right one." He was quiet for a moment. "You hurt this family, Noah. I want to say that plainly. I know. And you came back and did right by it, and I respect that more than I can easily say." George looked at his hands on the table. "There's not many men in your position who would. There's most men who would have kept the money and stayed away and told themselves it wasn't their fault." He looked up. "You're not most men." "I'm trying not to be," Noah said. "That's all any of us are doing." George extended his hand. "You have my blessing. Go ask my daughter." He asked her that same evening, walking with her in the south field where the first tentative green of early spring was beginning to push through the winter-beaten grass. He did not perform it. He said what was true, which was that he wanted to spend the rest of his life listening to her think out loud and working beside her and building something that lasted, and that he knew she was capable of choosing differently, and he hoped she would choose this. Violet Abbott had known for approximately 6 weeks that this was coming, and she had thought about it carefully and in detail, and she said yes with the completeness of a person who has done their due diligence. He produced a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small garnet set in plain silver that had come with him across every territory he had crossed in the past decade, kept in a cloth envelope in the bottom of his saddle bag, as the one personal object he had allowed himself to carry. It fit her hand as though it had been made for it, which George later called providential and which Violet, who was practical about most things, called coincidence, and then changed her mind. They were married in May of 1884 in the small white church on the east end of Redemption Springs, which had been in the territory for 12 years and had survived everything the West had thrown at it, as small white churches in small western towns tend to do. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Thomas Clay, who had been in the territory almost as long as the church and was better at weddings than eulogies, which he considered one of his finer blessings. Margaret Hale stood beside Violet and looked at her closest friend in the territory, with an expression that had no practical words attached to it and needed none. George Abbott gave his daughter away with the quiet dignity he brought to all significant moments, and his eyes were bright, and he did not attempt to conceal this. The church held perhaps 40 people, most of the town having developed an opinion about the Prescott-Abbott situation over the preceding months, and having arrived at approximately the same conclusion, that it was one of the more unusual love stories the territory had produced, and that it had the texture of something real. Noah held her hands at the altar and looked at her with an expression she had come to know, careful and unguarded simultaneously. That particular quality of his that she had decided was the most honest face a person could possibly wear, and said the words he had chosen with the seriousness they deserved. Violet said hers simply and with perfect steadiness, and thought about the version of herself that had stood in the sheriff's office 8 months before, the version that had been nothing but anger and damage and the precise memory of everything lost, and she sent that version of herself something she had not expected to be able to send: tenderness, understanding. The recognition that loss and grief are not the final vocabulary. They are the beginning of a different sentence. They celebrated at the ranch with dancing in the yard and good food and music, and the particular quality of light that May brings to the high desert, which is the most generous light the territory offers, warm and long and extravagant. Near midnight, when most of the guests had gone and the music had wound down and the lanterns were burning low in the warm dark, Violet and Noah stood together in the kitchen garden, the same kitchen garden where he had first heard her singing 4 years before, and she was aware of this coincidence, and he was aware that she was aware of it, and neither of them said anything about it because it did not need to be said. She hummed a few bars of the old hymn quietly and watched his face. He closed his eyes. "I have full permission this time," he said. "You do," she said. "You have everything." The summer and fall of 1884 were years of genuine building, not the nervous, compensatory kind that had characterized the previous autumn, but the confident, forward-facing kind that comes when the foundation has been properly settled. Noah's plan for the south section proved itself, the drainage work yielding a section of land that was genuinely productive for the first time in years. The east wall of the barn was rebuilt with lumber ordered from the mill in Santa Fe, which was better wood than anything available locally and worth the cost. George Abbott's health improved so markedly that by summer he was working a full day without visible fatigue, and his laugh came back, which Violet had not realized she had missed the specific texture of until it returned. Margaret Hale was married herself that autumn to a man named Caleb Trent, who had come to the territory from Ohio with the honest intention of farming, and had stayed when the farming proved better than he had expected. The wedding was in October, and Violet stood beside Margaret and returned the expression that Margaret had offered her in May, the one with no adequate words attached. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was spent in the warmth of a house that was no longer provisional. Violet continued her bookkeeping for the feed merchant 3 days a week, partly from habit and partly because she was genuinely good at it and liked having work that was entirely her own. Noah had taken on some horse trading with a stable in Roswell, working the connections he'd built in Tucson, and this proved sufficiently profitable that they could talk seriously about expanding the herd in the spring. In February, Violet told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, which was where they seemed to have all their important conversations, the lamp burning between them and the account books open on the table, and she said it in the plain, declarative way she said most important things, and then watched what happened to him. What happened to Noah Prescott was that he sat very still for approximately 15 seconds and then exhaled in a long, slow way that sounded like a man setting down something he had been carrying, and then he looked at her with an expression that was the most fully open she had ever seen on his face, the careful part entirely absent, and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said. And then he said it again, more quietly. "Good." He moved around the table and sat beside her and took her hand in both of his and said nothing else for a long time, and Violet, who was not given to weeping in company, discovered that there was a kind of happiness that expresses itself through the eyes whether you invite it or not, and decided to be fine about this as well. George Abbott's response to the news was to go outside and find a piece of wood that needed splitting and split it vigorously for about 20 minutes, which Violet correctly understood as his version of dancing. The baby was born in October of 1885, in the same room where 3 generations of the Abbott side of the family had been born, with the local midwife, Mrs. Garza, in attendance and Margaret Hale holding Violet's hand through the worst of it, and George walking the hallway outside with the measured, anxious pace of a man trying to be useful and finding no outlet for the energy. Noah stayed. He had been told he could wait outside, but he had asked, with the particular steadiness that meant he had thought carefully about what he was asking, if he could be present, and Violet had looked at him and said yes. He held her hand when Margaret needed both of hers for something else, and he was quiet and entirely useful in the contained, specific way that he was useful. And at approximately 2 in the morning, Mrs. Garza placed a very small, very definite person in his arms and said, "It's a boy." Noah Prescott looked down at his son and did not say anything for a long time. Violet, exhausted and entirely herself, watched him hold the baby and thought that this moment was not the end of anything difficult. History did not simplify itself into comfort. The things that had happened were still real. The damage was still real. The 3 years of her father's humiliation and her own grief were still real. But they had led, through improbable and unexpected paths, through a man's decision to turn around and ride back in hand over everything he had taken, to this kitchen and this ranch and this marriage and this midnight room with the lamp burning and a child in her husband's arms, and the word she found for what she felt about the whole improbable navigation of it was this: grateful. Not grateful that the harm had happened. Grateful that it had not been the end. Noah named him James, after a brother who had died young in Texas, and George Abbott approved of this choice with the approval of a man who understands the importance of naming. James George Prescott weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces, and appeared from his first hours to be opinionated about the quality of his sleep arrangements, which George said meant he was definitely an Abbott. The months that followed were full in the way that months with a new baby are full, which is completely and exhaustingly. Violet and Noah navigated the sleep deprivation and the learning curve and the comic disasters of new parenthood with the same practical competence they brought to most things, and found that it deepened something between them that had not had room to be deepened before, a specific quality of shared endurance that becomes its own kind of intimacy. James grew with the uncanny speed of children, as though they receive secret intelligence that time is finite and apply themselves accordingly. By spring, he was a rolling, reaching, perpetually interested infant who charmed everyone who met him, and was particularly devoted to his grandfather, a relationship that appeared to be fully mutual, and that George described with the transparent pride of a man trying to sound casual about the most important development in his life. In the summer of 1886, Harlan Cole was formally sentenced in the federal court in New Mexico Territory. He had been tried in a second jurisdiction in addition to Tucson, because the scope of his operations had been wider than even Noah's testimony had initially covered. The sentence was 14 years in Leavenworth. Noah received the notice by mail and showed it to Violet over breakfast, and they sat with it for a moment. "Is it enough?" she said. He thought about this. "It won't give back what people lost, but it stops him from taking more." He looked at her. "That matters." "It does," she said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the matter was closed. Noah had written, over the preceding year, to every person whose property or livestock or funds he had helped Cole take, a full accounting of what had been done, with an explanation of what had been returned where returning was possible, and an acknowledgement of what had not been possible to return. It had taken him the better part of 3 months to complete these letters, and Violet had helped him find some of the current addresses of people who had been displaced. He had not asked her to help. She had simply sat down one evening with the list and said she thought she could locate 3 of the people he hadn't found yet, and she had been right. Some of the people wrote back. Some did not. Of those who wrote back, most were formal and brief. A few were angry. One was grateful in a way that was difficult to read, the gratitude so large and raw that it was close to the same quality as grief. Noah read all the letters carefully and kept them with the ranch accounts, not as self-punishment but as record. "You're keeping a history," Violet said, one evening when she found him rereading one. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "That's the right thing to do." He looked at her. "You've always known what the right thing to do is." "Not always," she said, "but more often than not." She sat beside him. "Noah, you have to let yourself be something other than the sum of your worst years." "I know, do you?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm trying to." "You're the man who came back," she said. "Not many people come back. You came back and you gave back everything you could give, and you stayed and you're here." She gestured, a small, quiet sweep of her hand that meant the kitchen, the house, the sleeping child down the hall, the land outside, the whole improbable assembled fact of their life. "This is what you are. Let it be enough." He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, and closed his eyes and let it be. By the spring of 1887, the Abbott Prescott Ranch, as it had come to be known in Redemption Springs, was running a herd of 80 head and turning a consistent profit. Violet had taken on a second bookkeeping client, the Redemption Springs General Store, whose owner, a Mr. Brennan, had been doing his own accounts badly for years and was relieved to the point of visible emotion to hand them over. Noah's horse trading had expanded to include a formal arrangement with 2 ranches in the southern part of the territory, supplying them with broke horses trained to a standard they were willing to pay for. He was genuinely good at this, with the patience and the judgment that good horse work requires, and the reputation was solid. James, now a year and a half old, had taken his first steps in January on the kitchen floor, and had been attempting to climb everything vertical ever since. A developmental enthusiasm that George Abbott supported and Violet monitored carefully, and Noah addressed by building a low, solid fence around the more dangerous parts of the yard, which James regarded as a personal challenge. Margaret and Caleb Trent had a daughter that spring, whom they named Rose, and the Abbott Prescott household contributed a celebration and a quilt and the ongoing gift of close friendship, which Margaret and Violet had maintained across marriages and babies, and the general reorganization of domestic life, with the resilience of women who understand what real friendship is worth. George Abbott's health had stabilized at a level that was good for his age, which was 64 now, and he lived at the ranch as he always had, the gravitational center of the household in his quiet way, beloved by his grandson and his son-in-law, and his daughter with a warmth that did not require ceremony. One evening in May of 1887, Violet and Noah sat on the porch after supper with James asleep inside and George sitting just beyond the lamplight in the chair he had placed to see the stars, which he said were better looked at from that particular angle, and Violet had her head on Noah's shoulder. "Tell me something," she said. "Anything," he said. "Tell me what you think about when you think about the future, not the practical version, the other one." He considered this. Outside the porch, the spring night was in full voice, insects and wind and the distant sound of cattle moving in the north pasture. "I think about James growing up on this land," he said. "I think about what we'll teach him. How to work hard and do right and come back when he's done wrong. I think about you always in whatever room you happen to be in. I think about your father getting old here at this place, which is the right place for him." He paused. "I think about more children." She lifted her head to look at him. "Do you?" "I told you I think about it." She smiled, the real smile, the full one that she had never been able to produce for any audience she was thinking about. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. "Any conclusions?" "Some," she said. She left it there and he did not press, and the night went on around them. Their second child was born in March of 1888, a girl this time, and they named her Clara, for Violet's mother, who had planted the kitchen garden in a house in Missouri long before anyone had heard of Redemption Springs. Clara Abbott Prescott was a serious baby who seemed to be conducting thorough assessments of everything in her visual field, which Violet said indicated intelligence and Noah said indicated opinion, and George said that both were exactly right, and she was absolutely an Abbott. James, who was 2.5 and had been briefed extensively on the subject of the new baby, greeted his sister with the practiced solemnity of a child who has been informed this is an important occasion, and then immediately tried to show her his wooden horse, which she regarded with the distant composure of someone who has not yet developed equestrian interests. Redemption Springs in 1888 was a different town than it had been in 1878, when the Abbotts had arrived with their wagon and their draft horses and their plans. The population had grown. The main street had acquired a second mercantile and a proper hotel. The school where Margaret Hale taught now held 30 children in a building that had been expanded twice. The railroad had come through 20 miles to the south, at a junction town called Silver Flats, and this had changed the economics of the territory in the decisive way that railroads always did. It had also changed the land market, because railroad-accessible land was worth more, and this had attracted new speculators and new money, some of which was legitimate and some of which was not. Noah watched this development with the experienced eye of a man who understood exactly how land speculation operated, and he made sure the Abbott Prescott holdings were properly documented and legally clear in every respect, visiting the territorial court himself to verify the registration status of every parcel. He explained to Violet what he was doing and why, and she listened and understood and added her own layer of documentation to the household accounts. "You're thinking like someone who knows how the game is played," she said. "I know exactly how the game is played," he said, "which means I know how to make sure nobody plays it on us." She put her hand on his arm. "Good." Sheriff Morrow, who had been in the office since before the Abbotts had arrived in the territory, retired in the fall of 1888, and his replacement was a younger man named Harker who had been a deputy in Albuquerque. Morrow and his wife left the territory to go east to be near their grown children, and the town held a proper farewell that was one of the more moving public occasions Redemption Springs had witnessed, because Morrow had done his job with the specific kind of unglamorous integrity that communities rarely appreciate sufficiently until it is leaving. Noah shook his hand at the farewell supper and said, quietly, "Thank you for listening." Morrow, who was not given to sentiment, squeezed his hand and said, "You did the hard part. I just wrote it down." And that was the full obituary of an important transaction between two men who had understood each other. The years continued to build. James started school in the fall of 1889, walking to the schoolhouse with the confidence of a child who has always been taken seriously, and Margaret Hale, Margaret Trent now, was his teacher, which everyone agreed was a fine outcome. He was a capable student and a natural leader, the kind of boy who organizes the other children without apparent effort, and this was either going to be a gift or a problem depending on how it developed, and Noah and Violet agreed to watch it carefully. Clara remained serious and observational, and at 2 years old began talking in long, complete sentences that startled adults who had been expecting fragments. Her grandfather was her preferred audience and she was his. George Abbott could be found most mornings in the kitchen with Clara installed beside him, conducting what appeared to be genuine conversations on subjects that George reported afterward with the delighted disbelief of a man who keeps being surprised by the intelligence of a very small person. In the summer of 1890, Violet became expecting with their third child, which she announced to Noah with less ceremony than the first but no less significance, and he received it with the same quality of quiet, complete attention he brought to all the significant things she said to him, a habit that she had come to understand as one of the finest qualities he possessed. The third child was another boy, born in March of 1891, and they named him Henry after no one in particular, simply because they liked it and it suited him, which became evident from the first week when it was clear that he was going to be large, cheerful, and entirely comfortable with himself. 3 qualities that the name Henry seemed to suit. 3 children, a working ranch, a household that was full of work and noise and accumulated history, and the specific kind of love that is not separate from practical life, but woven through it. One evening in the spring of 1891, when Henry was 2 months old and James was 5 and Clara was 3, Violet stood at the kitchen window after the children were in bed, looking out at the land in the late evening light. Noah came and stood beside her, and they were quiet for a while. "Tell me honestly," she said. "Always," he said. "Are you happy?" He looked out at the land. The north pasture fence was straight and sound. The barn with its rebuilt east wall stood solid against the evening sky. The kitchen garden, planted every year since her mother's original planting in Missouri and Violet's replanting in New Mexico, was green and growing. "Yes," he said, "I'm happy." "You sound surprised." "A little," he said honestly. "I spent a long time expecting that the ledger would come due, that the things I did would ultimately cost more than what came after them." "Maybe they did," she said, "and you paid it, and then this is what came after the payment." He considered this. "You believe the accounting works out." "I believe the accounting doesn't stop just because one column looks long," she said. "I believe things can change. I know that because I watched it happen." She turned to look at him. "To you, to me, to my father, to this whole household," she held his gaze. "Things changed, Noah, they changed." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And outside the window the spring evening spread itself generously across the high desert, the light lasting long as it does in May, the land patient and unchanged, the mountains blue and permanent in the distance. He thought about the evening 4 years before he had met her formally, standing in the road with no reason to be standing there, hearing a voice from the kitchen garden, and feeling the world reconfigure itself around a single unnamed feeling. He thought about everything that had come between that moment and this one, the damage and the crimes and the long reckoning and the road back, all of it necessary apparently, all of it the price of the navigation that had led him here. He had returned everything he had ever taken: the land, the livestock, the money, the documentation of every wrong done in the service of Harlan Cole's careful greed. He had returned it with interest where interest was possible and with honest acknowledgement where return was not possible, and he had stayed to rebuild what his hands had helped to break. Everything, except the memory of her quiet voice. That he kept. He would keep it always. It was his. It had always been his, in the way that the experiences that change us become ours, the way the North Star becomes a traveler's own even though it belongs to the sky. He did not feel guilty about keeping it. He had asked her permission, technically. He had told her about it. One October evening in the kitchen, with the lamp between them and the harness in his hands, and she had looked at him and understood exactly what it was and had not asked him to give it back. Because you cannot return a memory. Because the memory of her quiet voice was not something stolen but something received through no agency of his in a moment before the harm was done, a moment that existed in the original account book of who they might have been to each other if the years between had gone differently. The years between had not gone differently, but the years ahead were going to go very well. George Abbott died in the winter of 1895, peacefully, in the room that had been his since the return to the ranch, with Violet beside him and the house quiet around him. He was 68 years old and he had seen his land restored, and his daughter flourishing, and his grandchildren growing, and his son-in-law become the kind of man that he had observed, in that first handshake in the sheriff's office, was possible. He had been a good man with a weakness for optimism that sometimes tipped into recklessness, and in the end the optimism had been fully justified, which is not always the case and is always a gift. Violet grieved her father the way she grieved everything, with full knowledge of what she had lost and full presence in the losing of it, without attempting to compress it into something manageable before it was ready to be compressed. Noah sat with her through it and did not attempt to make it smaller or quicker, and brought her coffee and handled the practical necessities, and held her hand in the evenings without requiring it to mean anything except what it meant, which was that he was there and was not going anywhere. James was 9 that winter, old enough to understand the loss and young enough to feel it unguardedly, and he grieved his grandfather openly, which Violet and Noah let him do. Clara was 7 and took the loss inward in a way that her parents watched carefully, and over the following months they saw it come out slowly, in questions asked at unexpected moments, in the particular attention she paid to the things George had left behind, his chair in the particular spot, his coffee cup on the shelf, his old work hat on the hook by the back door that nobody had moved. Henry, who was 4, would not remember George clearly as he grew, and this was the quiet sadness underneath everything else, because George had loved all 3 grandchildren with the uncomplicated totality of a man who had arrived at love through loss and was not going to qualify it. They buried him on the ranch, on the small rise behind the house that caught the morning light, and planted a juniper beside the grave that would take decades to be substantial, which seemed right. Life in Redemption Springs went forward as it does. James grew into the young man that the boy had promised, capable, responsible, with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and a quality of leadership that had resolved itself into something neither domineering nor passive but genuinely good. He worked the ranch alongside Noah from the time he was 12, with the serious pleasure of a person who has found their work. He had his grandfather's optimism, which Noah and Violet were grateful for, understanding what that quality was worth if it was paired with the right amount of caution. Clara studied everything. She read whatever she could obtain access to and had opinions about most of it and expressed them clearly and well. And Margaret Trent, who had taught her through the full span of the Redemption Springs School, told Violet privately that Clara was the finest student she had taught in 20 years of teaching. There was talk, as Clara grew older, about the normal school in Albuquerque, and then about the possibility of further education east. Violet listened to these discussions with the complicated pride of a parent who wants everything for her child and understands that some of what a child will become will take them away. Henry was a different kind of person from his siblings, expansive where they were focused, warm where they were precise, cheerful in a way that was structural and not performed. He made friends without apparent effort and kept them, and he had a natural gift with animals that expressed itself early and clearly, riding before he was 5 with the easy authority of someone who speaks the language. He and Noah spent long hours in the barn and the pasture, and this was a particular pleasure in Noah's life, the specific, unhurried happiness of teaching his youngest son the things he knew best. The ranch continued to expand steadily through the 1890s, the herd growing and the horse operation developing a reputation that reached well into the surrounding territories. Violet's bookkeeping work had expanded similarly, and she had at various points counted 5 different businesses among her clients, managing the accounts with the efficiency of someone who has always been better at numbers than most people around her. Redemption Springs itself had grown into a proper town by the turn of the century, a real hotel, 2 churches, a bank, a doctor's office, a small newspaper that had started publication in 1893 and covered the territory's affairs with the slightly breathless energy of an enterprise that still cannot quite believe it exists. Noah was, in this world, simply Noah Prescott, husband, father, rancher, horse trader, the man who had rebuilt the Abbott ranch and stayed to work it and whose word was understood to be good in every transaction he entered. The history of how he had arrived in Redemption Springs was known to some people and not others, as histories always are, and those who knew it had arrived at approximately the same assessment that George Abbott had offered in that first handshake. He came back. More than that could not fairly be required. He was 43 years old in the year 1900, which was the year Violet sat him down at the kitchen table, Always the kitchen table, always the lamp, always the two of them as the house settled around them, and told him that after 15 years of building this life, she found that she was still daily choosing it, choosing him. Not from obligation or habit, though habit was present, and she was not one to dismiss the honest value of habit, but from the active, renewed, morning by morning decision of a person who looks at what they have and finds it genuinely good. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, this woman who had said, "Why?" to him in a sheriff's office with a land deed in her shaking hands and 3 years of earned fury in her chest. This woman who had left the door open after their first real conversation. This woman who had told him she had been in love with him since mid-October with the weary frankness of someone tired of being rational. This woman who had sung in the kitchen garden on a dusk evening in 1879 and changed the entire direction of his interior life without knowing he existed. He thought about everything that word still contained, the harm and the return and the years of building and the 3 children and the graves and the accounts and the fence lines and the winter mornings and the summer evenings and the lamp between them and the juniper outside and the voice that had started all of it, the quiet voice in the kitchen garden that he had carried and kept and been changed by. He reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Violet," he said. "Noah," she said. It was the full vocabulary, the only vocabulary that had ever been adequate. 15 years of a life they had built out of damage and reckoning and the improbable grace of a man who had turned around, and a woman who had left a door open, and the memory of a voice in a kitchen garden that had worked in the deep underground of a person's heart like water works in rock slowly, irreversibly, shaping the passage through which everything else would eventually flow. Outside, the New Mexico night was full of stars, and the sound of the land doing what it had always done, expanding and cooling and continuing, patient and permanent, and entirely indifferent to the small human things that happened on its surface. Except that tonight a lamp burned in a kitchen window, and 2 people sat across a table, holding each other's hands in the light of everything they had survived and built and become to each other. And in the room down the hall, James Prescott, who was 14 and had inherited his grandfather's gift for sleep, was dreaming whatever a 14-year-old dreams about on a quiet Tuesday in October. And Clara Prescott, 12 years old and serious as water, had fallen asleep over a book as usual, and it would be folded shut and put on her shelf by her mother's careful hands. And Henry Prescott, 9 years old and entirely himself, was sleeping the deep, unconcerned sleep of a child who has never once doubted that the world where he woke up in the morning was solid and safe and full of people who loved him, which it was. The lamp burned. The stars spread out overhead. The ranch was sound, the fence was straight, the accounts were balanced. And Noah Prescott, who had returned everything he had ever taken, held in his chest the one thing he would not return, the memory of her quiet voice, the original, irreducible beginning of all of it, and found that this possession, this single kept thing, was not the remnant of his past but the foundation of his present, and that he had been for 15 years daily building on it. He was grateful. She was grateful. And outside the window, the kitchen garden moved in the evening wind, the way it always had, the way it always would, patient and growing and quietly, continuously alive.